Steve is someone who I have followed the work of quite closely for a number of years, and probably only more recently kind of connected with him a little more personally. So we don't know each other very well. We have had a few chances to interact, and I'm really excited about diving into a conversation today. So thanks for joining us, Steve.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Not at all. Not at all. It's really hard to know where to start with you, brother. I mean, there's just so much to you. There's a lot of quivers there that you're holding, and I guess for me, I was kind of intrigued, kind of overall about your work. Obviously, it seems to me you work one-on-one with all kinds of people around the world, from kind of actors and musicians through to kind of senior executives, and then obviously in your group workshops and things. But it seems to me you're coming at it from the body point of view, from the mind point of view, and probably, I guess, also kind of helping people with, I don't know, I guess navigating their experiences in life. Would that be a way of putting it?
Yep.
So maybe kind of, can I leave it to you to kind of frame up what it is you do?
Sure. As you said, it's a lot of quivering going on, a lot of quivers, arrows in the quiver. Yeah. I mean, strictly speaking, I work one-on-one with people, and I work in workshop contexts as well. And it's sort of the intersection between high performance, relationships, sexuality, things of that nature, meditation, the body, and all these sorts of embodiment, I suppose you could say, all those sorts of things. And at the moment, I'm very often collaborating and teaching with Michaela Boehm. And she's a very well-regarded relationship therapist and counselor of 30 plus years experience. And so, we have quite an interesting breadth of, and she founded a rehab, so, in Malibu in her time. I mean, if I go into her bio, we'll be here a long time. She's just very experienced. And so we have quite an interesting mix that we bring together. And I'm interested in a lot of things. So from a marketing point of view, brand point of view, it's not, it's a bit of a brand person's nightmare, I think, because I like to interview interesting people on my podcast, and depending on what I'm interested in and who I'm interested in, the people can be really rather different. So we might have some person who spent 30 years in Dharamsala as a translator of ancient Tibetan texts one day, and then we have somebody who works with veterans PTSD the next day, and so on. And there's really quite a wide range. So I think that's what characterizes my output, really, is sort of following my interest in that sense, putting things out there, doing things of that nature. But my private client work is more narrowly related to, as you say, intersection of high performance relationships, the body, the mind, things like that.
So I know it's a big question, but how do you see that interrelationship? Like, obviously embodiment and all those things, people are working a lot in that space at the moment, but what's kind of the Steve James kind of bent on the way all that comes together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you as we were saying before we started recording, I do have a bit of a different way of looking at some of those topics. I mean, where do you want me to start? I could start with embodiment, I suppose. That'd be, yeah. I mean, embodiment's one of those words that it can be correctly used in many different ways. There are lots of words like that. So, for instance, right now my laptop here is on the table. I can put my laptop on the table, or I can table emotion at a meeting. They're the same word, but they're used in very different ways. And they're perfectly valid different ways that the word can be used. And embodiment is the same. And I always like to really ponder definitions. And what do we mean when we say things, especially when it's a buzzword or it's a lingo word or, words of the trade kind of thing. And for me, embodiment means very, very specifically intimacy with the sensations of the body, or feeling the sensations that the body's generating. That's what it means for me. when I use the word. Now, to be specific, if you were to, right now feel your own body, and there's two things happening. There's, in a certain sense, raw data flowing in that reveals the presence of the body. So maybe you can feel your bottom on the chair or the clothing on your skin. And then there's the mind labeling and categorizing, saying that's the bottom on the chair, that's the clothing on my skin. And tuning into that raw sensory data before it becomes labeled and categorized by the mind is, you could say, a good example for me that highlights what I'm talking about when I talk about embodiment. If you had no memory of your body, we always assume we have a body because usually we assume that because it was there the last time we checked. And we have a sense of our body that's not only informed by and created by what we can feel right now, but also by our previous experience of having had a body and our expectations of having a body in the future. And so sometimes I ask people to imagine they had no memory of their body, no model or concept of their body, and what can they actually feel? That's what I'm talking about when I say feeling the sensations that the body's generating. So it's not attempting to get into a certain kind of state, a positive state, say aiming for a positive state, or a state of integration, or a sense of wholeness. Why not? Well, because when you feel what's there to be felt, that initial contact step with the sensations that the body are generating, there's no telling what you're going to feel. Sometimes I say there's no informed consent on intimacy. You don't know what you're going to feel until you feel it. And so you don't know how your body's going to feel. So if you feel your body, as a very narrow example, it might feel good, it might feel bad. It might be pain, there might be a peaceful, pleasurable feeling. There could be all sorts of feelings. And so anxiety or, joyous feeling, anything. So sometimes we confuse the contact step with the response step, if you like. And so embodiment to me is the capacity to feel what the sensations that the body is generating. What you then do with those sensations is a discrete second step. And I'd like to make that distinction. Very often, if we collapse the contact step and the response step together, then we end up rejecting what we're feeling in favor of a state that we call embodiment. So you feel disintegrated and out of sorts, or maybe numb. So that's, in a certain sense, we don't even really notice that or even feel that, because straight away we've collapsed the two steps and now we're off into gaining integration and sensitizing and gaining kind of sense of wholeness. So I like to make that distinction. I'm not against optimizing conditions and making oneself feel good or trying to feel better or trying to feel whole and integrated. I think those are excellent. In fact, I think in a certain sense, they're inevitable. The momentum of the organism is to optimize its conditions, depending on its own pleasure pain calculation. We're not always so informed there, but we always are basically trying to do what's good for us, what we think is good for us. So I'm not against that at all, but there's a step that right before the response, which is the contact step. I could talk about embodiment for much longer, but there's a bit of a sense.
No, absolutely. I think that's amazing. And just that brief little piece that you put out there, I think it's going to be extraordinarily helpful for people listening. But it's interesting. I note around you sort of saying you optimize the environment for what you think is good for you. And I guess based on the stories that you tell yourself, based on the other two parts that we talked about, the mind and the experience, that potentially they may not be best for you. You're just optimizing it based on what you know or what experiences you've had in the past. And this is, I guess, for you where it all sort of comes together, right?
Right. Yes, you're leading us back to your first question. Yeah, that's right. And sometimes I think about bringing the body to the board of advisors. Like maybe you imagine King Arthur's round table, and you have different people, different knights at the round table. And you've got, your childhood conditioning, your cultural conditioning, your previous life experience. You've got all these different sort of factors that go into your board of advisors that inform your pleasure pain calculation. And, then you can bring the body to the table of advisors as well. What's the body saying? What data is the body giving us? Some people, I think, go a bit to the other way, and they get in touch with their body maybe after having not been in touch with it for a long time, and suddenly it becomes a dictatorship of the body. The body takes control, or we cede all authority to the body. And you sometimes see this, Michaela always jokes, you can't you can't proceed without your green juice and so on. But there's all sorts of times when you need to override the body, and the ability to override the needs of the body for the greater good, and we'll come back to what I mean by that, is necessary for any person. Sometimes when you get up in the morning, you don't want to wake up and go to work and get up and eat, make your breakfast or whatever it is. You don't want to get out of bed. At least if you're like me, sometimes I want to stay in bed, and that's what my body wants, you could say, but I override it, and get up. And there's all sorts of other situations like that where you have to override your body. But it's one thing to override your body when you can't feel it, but there's another thing to sort of, in another sense, have it part of the conversation, and you can choose whether or not to sort of to go that way. And when I say greater good, and you pointed to that, what's good for us, and it's difficult to say because we have our pleasure pain calculation. Humans, I think, are motivated generally towards pleasure and away from pain. And so, but there's two different dimensions, at least, in that calculation. I mean, number one, we don't have all the data. We don't know the future. In a certain sense, we're always a little bit guessing as to the outcome of an action. We can predict it fairly well, but there's always an element of unpredictability there. So you never really know if the thing that you're aiming for is going to be helped or hindered by the actions you're taking, even if you've got the best of intentions. We don't have all the data. But also there's a temporal dimension, which is really tricky, the dimension of time. What feels good now may not be good for you tomorrow or next week or next month. And sometimes something that doesn't feel good now is good for you later. In other words, one has to really speculate to some degree as to the effect of your actions over time, and kind of average the sort of good for you-ness of something based on not enough data, not actually really knowing necessarily what's good for us, and also not knowing how things are going to play out over time. It's like delayed gratification is another way of describing that temporal axis. There are people who just do what they feel is good for them right in that moment. And of course, they don't usually have very much going for them on a kind of ongoing basis. They're impulsive, let's say, or compulsive. But on the other hand, if you're too kicking the can down the road and delayed gratification, then in a sense, you haven't got a life worth living. You can't smell the roses. So there is, I think, a sweet spot that's always moving, which is another annoying thing about life. The sweet spot's always moving between what do you want now, what's good in the future. And there's this kind of tug of war, which is contextualized, like I said, by complete ignorance of, well, not complete ignorance, but basically ignorance of what's going to actually happen.
Yeah.
So it's really funny. So we just do the best, don't we?
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by all that. And I know that in your own life, I mean, you've obviously spent times with a lot of discipline in your life through your meditation practices. But I'm also, as you were talking, I was thinking about the time that you've deliberately placed yourself in some pretty adverse conditions out in nature as well. So I'm certain there was plenty of times there when the body was screaming at you to do something different, but you've kind of maintained the course, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and you obviously see the benefits in that. I mean, the time you spent out in nature, was that through hobby or passion, or was it through something else?
Yeah, both hobby and passion. I mean, I think you're referring to some of the more extreme kind of outdoors things I've done, which have typically been some sort of survival course. I attended a survival that I've attended, not taught. I don't teach survival skills, but yeah, and for sure, I went out there in the Arctic for 10 days without a tent, and we did things like that in the Arctic Circle. In the deep winter of northern England, with not eating for 7 days just to see what it's like, and at the same time surviving with only your belt kit, what you've got on you, no backpacks, no extra gear and stuff, all that sort of stuff. And it's challenging psychologically. It's also actually one of the aspects of it that I think is not often recognized. Yes, it is difficult. We could talk about that if you like, but it's extremely simple. The beautiful thing about it is in a survival situation, which is different from a camping or bushcraft situation. In a survival situation, you sort of handicap yourself a bit. You say to yourself, okay, well, a survival situation, something's gone wrong, hasn't it? You know, it's not, when you're training for a survival situation, you have to, in a way, handicap yourself a bit or put yourself in a kind of simulated stuff's gone wrong scenario. Otherwise, it's just camping. So, which I also like. You know, and one of the great things about survival is that, in fact, it's overwhelming for people. People don't know what to do next if they've never thought about it. People think, well, do I need food? Do I need water? They never think about shelter generally, and then it rains and they die of hypothermia. You know, how long do I have to get found? You know, what's the typical sort of 72-hour window that one has to get found? How do I decide whether to stay put or move? You know, there are all these sorts of decisions that are actually pretty logical and straightforward if you've been trained to think, you know, trained that way with proper case studies and experience. You just do the next thing you have to do in the order that you have to do it. And you might survive and you might die, not in a supervised situation, but, you know, in the simulation, you might survive or you might die. But there's really very little conundrum in that kind of a situation, and it's nice. So okay, here we are. We need to find wood for the fire, and then with this for this, and it's the simplicity and the sort of full-bodied simplicity of one task after the next. Especially after you have you start to haven't eaten for a few days, and certain higher brain functions start to shut down, and you have to start to operate kind of based on skill, based on routine, based on experience in this kind of consistent work output, not spikes of work output, and just sort of trucking along. There's something, I don't know, pure about it, like relaxing about it, mentally, existentially. You're free of all responsibilities other than attempting to survive. And I mean, that's the plus side that people I don't think realize unless they've done outdoorsy sorts of things.
And, you know, taking it to a higher level, I guess I like the work of, you know, John Muir and Thoreau and people, and talking about the kind of spiritual nature of being out there with the elements. It's something more than just the physical side of it. Do you feel you tap into that when you're out there amongst that stuff?
Yeah, I think that's the big draw, isn't it, for so many people? Not everyone, you know, would describe it as spiritual, particularly. It depends on your concept of the word.
Right.
But there's something to it. I think simple. When I said the word pure, I think there's something there. There's something there that points to that spiritual dimension. Yeah, there is. And, you know, people do those sorts of vision quests, don't they? Where they go out and sit on the hill for 4 days without food or water, for instance.
Yeah, I think we're all drawn to it if we can kind of hear the call within us to do these things, you know?
Yeah, but my point was, I don't think needs to be explicitly a spiritual or soul-searching venture for it to kind of suggest those qualities. Nature seems to suggest that, seems to invite that. It seems to make the space for that natural part of human beings to come out, I found. And also I have found great camaraderie and deep sort of camaraderie and bonds that are built in those sorts of situations with people.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's probably a nice segue to talk about, you know, some of the work that we're doing at Warrior Within, and, you know, getting the men out in nature together and kind of building a brotherhood that way seems to be, you know, a fantastically strong way of building those connections, of building that brotherhood, building that tribe, if you will. Yeah,
I think the way I like to think about things like that, like what you're, you know, the sorts of things you're doing, it's smart, because, you know, the ways in which I've been, if you want, deeply informed, you're doing men's work, for instance, the ways that I've been deeply informed by other men in that kind of man-to-man kind of a way, it's very rarely an explicit explanation or pointing towards some sort of concept or some sort of, you know, live up to this, or this is the way you do things. It's rarely been that way. I found it's almost always been by osmosis, you know, demonstrated in the doing of it. And I think when guys get together and do something together, there is a beautiful self-organization that tends to happen. A hierarchy manifests itself, not one of the, and anyway, and lessons are learned, and it's something good about that. I think one of the things that one learns outdoors, or that I learned out doing the outdoor sorts of things, is that hierarchy is a function. Leadership is a function. It's not a sort of fundamentally a status symbol in those situations. So if you're all outdoors, someone's got to take charge. Someone's got to take the lead. And that's a role. It's a function. And it doesn't always have to be the oldest, doesn't always have to be, who's the leader can change. And then actually, there's a pleasure in being a part of a hierarchy that's a team. It's not like you're a bottom dog and you feel like you want to climb up. It's actually as honorable being in the middle or the bottom or something like this if you play your part correctly. And a good hierarchy, I think, especially among men in that way, can function like that. It values every part of it because every part of it's essential. If the leader has no one to lead, then it doesn't exist. But similarly, without a leader, nothing gets done. Too much committee outside, it doesn't work.
No, I think that's beautifully put. And I guess, shifting gears to a more generic question now we're sort of talking about the men's stuff. It's if I can ask you a really broad question, Steve, and that's kind of, here we are in 2020, what does being a man mean to you? What does it look like to you?
That's a really interesting question, I think. And there's so many different levels I could answer it on. But you know what? I'll say one thing that strikes me immediately. And this isn't comprehensive or this is just an angle on it, right? But I'd say in a way, what does being a man in 2020 mean to me? My being a man is much the same in 2020 as it's been in all my life. From a certain point of view, I didn't do anything to be a man. I just came out that way. I was born a man or a male, so I've always been one. And does my being a man imbue a certain kind of extra meaning or significance to me in terms of identity? Not so much. And does my being a man provide a deliberate kind of impetus to me in terms of what I should be doing day to day? Not so much for me. It affects my life in all kinds of ways. It opens certain doors, it closes others. In much the same way as other inherited factors, such as family of origin or my IQ or my height, my facial proportions, as well as innumerable other factors. That's one way of analyzing that. And when you think about the 2020, now if we think about 2020, and if we consider the span of human history, and people and men, therefore, as a subset of people, have always faced a landscape of challenge and opportunity. And when I look back at previous generations, wars they've had to face, which are rather inconvenient. Wars are rather inconvenient for your sort of one's self-actualization. Famine also rather gets in the way of living your dream. Disease, poverty. I think we live better than most kings these days. Not everyone in the whole world, but relatively speaking, I think today is the greatest time to be alive as a person. It's not perfect, but it's the greatest time. And there's such an abundance of opportunity and freedom and education and information so readily available, relatively speaking. It's not perfect. That's not to say that there aren't, special challenges in 2020, but I think almost all of them are variations on the perennial challenges that humans have always faced. And I know, and you were saying to me earlier before we started talking that you do a lot of work with death and you do death workshops where people consider death and face death and talk about death. And you also mentioned that the fear of death is one of the great root fears that drives and motivates a lot of behavior and underwrites a lot of fears. And I think that's very, very true. And that's not a new problem. That's not a 2020 problem.
Mm.
Humans have been facing death and dying in their millions since humans have been alive, haven't they?
Oh, look, absolutely. In fact, we've fought many religious wars over what I think happens after you die versus what he thinks happens after you die. And I'm going to hold on to my view so tightly based on my fear of death, perhaps, that I'll kill you for it, which is, there's a certain irony in that as well. But that's
One way
what's
to
been
find
going
out,
on.
isn't it?
What's that?
One way to find out.
One way to find out. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's beautifully put again in terms of manhood in 2020. I think that there are some particular problems which I feel are surrounding masculinity in modern society. We're looking at sort of what's happening today around the Me Too campaign, etc., etc. And I think there are a particular set of problems that men have to face, address, consider, which maybe haven't been around in this particular context before. I'm wondering, can you talk to that at all? Or?
Yeah, I can certainly see what you're getting at there. For example, Me Too movement, you mean?
Yeah, among other anything else perhaps around the whole concept of toxic masculinity, which you can define in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, I could speak to that. You know, for instance, when it comes to the Me Too movement, one uncomfortable truth or one uncomfortable, well, yeah, I'm trying to choose my words very carefully so I can be accurate. One is brought face to face. Well, let's put it this way: there are lots of problems in our society, and lots of difficulties that people face, and things that people do, naughty things that people do to each other, and cruel things, exploitation, and we don't really see it a great deal unless it affects us directly. And something that the Me Too movement does, I think, is it highlights and brings into the foreground something that has been going on and still goes on, which is, to be very specific about it, sexual harassment, for example. I think it at its most clearly defined. Now, of course, there's sexual assault and so on and so forth, but I think the Me Too. Not that I'm an expert on Me Too, but it's not only about sexual assault and rapes and so on and so forth. It's also about sexual harassment. The implication that, well, if we have a sexual encounter, then maybe you'll progress, or so on and so forth. So there's this part of life. So I think for a lot of men, I've spoken to a lot of men about this. A lot of men come to me, and this is what they say. They say, "Wow, what if I'm doing something like that unconsciously? Let's say, what if some of the behaviors that I'm a good person, but what if some of the things that I do that I didn't think of as bad are bad now?" And that, we need to only look back into history and see that there are lots of great people who, by today's standards, would be morally very backward. Great pioneers, indeed, sometimes pioneers of moral and civil reformation, who actually, by today's standards, due to the context in which they lived so far in the past, if you were to judge them by today's standards, they would be very unprogressive, maybe even in prison, something like that. So, that's and so people say, oh gosh, the rules are changing, things are changing, things are redefining, things are being exposed, pendulums are swinging. What am I doing? What can I do? How can I proceed? What is sexual harassment or sexual oppression? What about, is it harmful to ask somebody out on a date who doesn't want to go on a date with you? Would the discomfort that you put them in, the discomfort that they feel due to your having asked them out, does that constitute a kind of subtle violence? That's the question that a lot of chaps who talk to me are genuinely asking. It used to be, don't want to ask ladies out, or I don't want to ask people out because if they say no, I'll feel really embarrassed. But now it's like, I don't want to be an oppressive, horrible person who's sexualizing a person. And so you can see. So that leaves you very interesting paralysis in a way. And I've noticed a lot of men feel quite paralyzed by um, the possibility that they are being, or the ambiguity around the rules of engagement. Let's just put it that way for a start.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate in terms of what we're hearing amongst men as well. I mean, I would say there's just a certain amount of confusion about how to show up as a man, and many of them feel that the power has been taken away simply because they're confused about how to act in the world, how to be in the world. Part of us is saying the masculine energy, we need to go and penetrate the world, but then, or maybe I should just sort of bury myself in the corner and kind of not poke my head out for fear of doing the wrong thing because I'm not sure what the right thing is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this, penetrate the world thing is, I do think it's very foolish, but and ill thought out. But I do, it is galvanizing for some people. They think that, and I think it's a bit silly. But I just don't think it works even by its own measure, even in its own ecosystem. That phrase is troublesome. But yeah, I mean, what do you do? What do you do? And there's a lot of this sort of thing, men step back and so on. And then, so, one of the things I like to do is I like to sort of take, for instance, in mediation or in any kind of conflict resolution or conflict things, it's really important to be able to take on the other perspectives that are in the room. So of course, myself, I have my perspective in a conflict. And if someone is criticizing a group to which I belong, I may feel attacked by that. And indeed, I may be being attacked. But one of the real things I like to try to do, and I haven't finished doing this, is to try to take on the other perspectives and try to see things from their point of view and assume they're correct, just for the sake of exploring the point of view. And I think that's what's handicapping chaps. It's not that everyone is unjustly calling me an oppressor. It's not only that. I mean, some guys are saying that, oh, I'm not an oppressor, don't call me an oppressor. I mean, that's just conflict. But it's the chaps who are thinking a bit more deeply about it and saying, I don't think I am, I'm not, but by this measure, I can't even draw breath without imposing myself on another, and so on. And that, I think, is part of what's paralyzing. And so I've seen many chaps to say, I'm not interested, I'm out. I don't want to play that game. Why should I? Why should I? Saw my friend down the road there who got divorced, and now he's living in a tent in the park, still paying for the house. And they see that sort of thing, can't visit his children. They see these sorts of things going on, and they say, what's in it for me? Why should I? And sometimes they come to me and say, why should I? And I say, well, and I ask them to explain their reasons. And it's not that they're not seeing something, it's that they're just seeing too clearly. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, that's definitely another rabbit hole that we could dive down for sure. But is this conversation now some of the stuff that you and Michaela do together in the workshops that you run?
So, to some degree, I'm mainly just bouncing off what you're saying. I don't tend to talk. I wouldn't talk on these things unless it came up in Q&A or something like that. We do, of course, in our workshops, there's all sorts of interactions, person to person. There's also the sort of romantically charged or erotically charged kind of side of things as well that we do. Or if you want rather to say it, polarized between men and women, or same-sex couples, or whatever the case may be. We do explore the spark aspect of things. So in that sense, there is some overlap. And yes, some chaps are paralyzed, and they feel paralyzed in the entire endeavor. And yeah, it's very tricky. It's very tricky. You've got to crack some eggs to make an omelet. You've got to break some eggs to make an omelet, as the saying goes. And I think one of the interesting reactions to this sort of thing is it said, well, a man's role is to be in the family, and a man's role is to be in a healthy sort of monogamous, good, pure, above reproach kind of relationship. That's one of the fixes, because now everyone's sort of scrambling around trying to define what's a good man, what should a man be doing, and and so on. And that's a whole kind of worms. And one of the ways is, well, you should, be sort of traditional and do this sorts of things. It doesn't really work so well, a lot of the guys are finding. And in order to even find and get the sort of experience necessary for that, you have to make an awful lot of mistakes. That's the price, if you want, of freedom. And as a man, I think we have a great deal of freedom fundamentally. And the price of that, of course, is we have to risk making mistakes. So unless you happen to be sitting next to somebody at 17 years old, and you sort of see them, in a school disco or something like that, and you hold hands, and then at 18, you get married and everything's fine. Unless it goes like the Waltons or something like that, it's going to be difficulty. You're going to date people you shouldn't. You're going to do things you shouldn't. You're going to make mistakes. Ask people out who don't want to go out with you. Some people want to go out with you, and you shouldn't go out with them.
Yeah. No, it's
that's just this life, isn't it? That's the way of these things,
No, 100%. And I think a lot of men, I find, are very afraid of making mistakes. So, which isn't a great starting point, because obviously it's required.
Yeah, when I think about those things, I sometimes think about risk assessment. Risk assessment has different dimensions to it. One of them is how likely is the thing to happen, and the other is how bad is it if it happens. And those are, of course, they intersect. If something is extremely high risk, then even if there's a relatively small chance of it happening, then you're probably going to be quite averse to it. If something is pretty low risk and it's unlikely to happen, well, then, that's just crossing the road, isn't it? On the other hand, if something is, low risk and really extremely likely to happen, like, I don't know, shooting a basketball and missing, something like this, it's like, well, what does it matter? And then you're more likely to try and so on. So it's one of the things is to try to quantify and figure out, what are the risk factors here? What exactly am I afraid might happen? Write that down. Make it really clear. What do I think might happen? Okay, there's that. What is the chance? What are the likelihood of it happening? What do I think is the likelihood of happening? Is there anything I can use to verify that? And then you make your decisions. And that can come to some uncomfortable conclusions. And like I said, some of the men that I've heard talk about this have done that risk assessment and come to the conclusion that the thing to do is to turn away from romantic dating and so on. The risk reward ratio does not work for them. They don't want to risk that. They don't want to go that route. So they look for other options. And I think that's always been a thing that men have done in the past. That's probably part of the reason why we have monks. Part of the reason why people join the military and things like that throughout history. Yeah. It's a different way of life. And so it's a very fascinating time, and everything seems to be up in the air.
Look, I think that's a fascinating discussion. And I remember listening to you chatting with Trevor Boehm not that long ago, and you were talking about a topic related to this. I think he asked you a question around relationships. It was like, well, do I or don't I get into a relationship? And you started to talk about relationships in general. And I thought that was fascinating. And I was wondering if you could maybe share some of that thinking with the men today.
Yeah. Let's see if I can remember what I said. Yeah. I said something like relationship is, gosh, I wish I could remember the entire thing. I said something like relationship is unavoidable.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. Let's see. Maybe I have some notes somewhere. No, I don't think I did that. It was off the top of my head. Yeah, relationships unavoidable. Yes, Trevor was, I think was asking me if I'm for or against relationship. This was after a fairly long discussion we'd had about the pros and cons of.
That's it.
Yeah. And, I did say that a relationship is inevitable and unavoidable. We're always in relationship, and say not dating doesn't save you from the burden of being or the messy, the messiness of being in relationship. We're always in relationship. We're in relationship with everything around us, and we're in relationship with everyone around us. The clothes I'm wearing came from somebody else. Someone made them. I don't know how to make this lovely woolen sweater, but someone does. So I'm in this sort of interesting, I'm supported, if you want, in a way, by whoever made that sweater, and vice versa, by the flow of the money and so on. So we're all, in a certain sense, fundamentally in relationship. And we're in relationship with ourselves and with the circumstances that we're in. And that, I think, that desire to insulate oneself and protect oneself from the hurt and harm of relationship, I totally understand it. Like Simon and Garfunkel's song, I'm a rock, I'm an island, and a rock feels no pain, and an island never cries, right? This is a Simon and Garfunkel song, which I think, man, if you listen to that on a certain day when you're feeling a certain mood, yeah, I mean, let's build a moat. Right. Let's build a moat and isolate myself from the world. And you can do that, but you won't fundamentally be isolated from relationship. There is no sealing oneself off against interrelationship with life, with change, and so on. And that's not to say that you have to date somebody. That's not what I'm saying at all. I was casting, as you said, the net much more broadly than that, and saying, okay, let's examine what. So let's say one decides to swear off dating, right? Which people have done. People are doing that. Some people, I've heard them say it. Great. Let's say you've made a risk-reward strategy and that works for you, and you've decided to do that. That's excellent. What's left is, don't examine the degree to which there's an additional attempt to completely seal oneself off from all kind of relationship. It may be that for you at this time, that's a correct risk-reward assessment to not date, let's say. Maybe you feel that's really important. That's great. Then you have to then open yourself up to the inevitability of other kinds of relationship, which are already always happening. And that can be the heartbreak. That can sometimes break the heart open because one is there, vulnerable on all sides. Because the problem with relationships, it's multi-vector. It can happen from all things. Something can come from behind, above, below. You can sit with your back against the wall, but you don't know where things are going to come from when they come your way. One phone call with a diagnosis or a test result from the doctor can throw you into your vulnerability to causes and conditions in a way that's quite remarkable. So I think that, and death, to come back to your topic, you mentioned death before we started. That's why I keep thinking about it.
Yeah.
That's where it all goes. And you can't negotiate with death. You can't ask death for 5 more minutes or 10 more seconds. When death comes, that is something like that. Sometimes in certain traditions, death and falling asleep they're analogous, because in falling asleep, you of course go from being conscious to unconscious. At least most people do that. But you also start to have a series of physiological changes and cycle. You of course, the senses seal off, the body temperature drops, the respiration changes, the body goes into sort of paralysis in a way, and you go into a kind of little death, and then you wake up the next day. You've become reincarnated on a Tuesday, in a way, and the same but different, the next day. But I sometimes when I fall asleep, I think about that. And that is an exploration that's suggested in some traditions, that as you fall asleep, try to feel quite aware of what are the changes going on, what's happening as you fall asleep. Most of the time we fall asleep, we're awake and we relax and we just go unconscious. But if you stay a little bit aware, you can actually see some of these physiological changes as you slip into sleep happening. And sometimes I reflect that at the time of death, depending on how you die, there'll be a similar possibly procession. There'll be a time when I'll feel the body temperature drop slightly and it won't ever get warm again. Or I'll start to lose control and strength in my limbs and it won't ever come back. Unlike sleep, where I go to sleep and I assume, because I have good evidence, that I'm going to wake up the next day. What would it be like if this was the last receding of my being, if you want, in this way? That's very profound for me. And to feel that, and to feel my mortality, if you want, I find that very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, with kind of the removal of the elements, and as you say, permanently, as opposed to in sleep when you assume they'll be coming back. It's a fascinating discussion.
Just a minute. Wait, one more thing.
Yeah.
That's that, I don't know if you've ever had that when you fall asleep and you sort of go, oh, wait, one more, I forgot to brush my teeth, or, oh, wait, I should do
And
it
then
all
the
again.
fight with the body to actually get upright again. It's interesting.
That will not be an option beyond a certain point, sort of certain point.
100%.
And that I find deeply moving, actually. And considering my own death, of course, is one way of looking, but also thinking about other people. And I find looking at other people as they walk around, sitting in an airport or a cafe, and looking at people walking around, moving around, it can tenderize the heart to see their body as it moves through time and space, particularly time, aging, this sort of thing, changing, vulnerable, held together for now, the patterns woven together for now, but ultimately destined. Now, reincarnation or such things aside, right? At least at the moment, those patterns to dissolve back into the milieu from which they were formed. And I'm not, you don't have to be spiritual to understand that. Just look at a decomposing body. I mean it on that kind of a level. The biomatter of the body degrades again. And where did that matter come from? It came from the earth, came from, this sort of system, and it goes back into that. There's something very moving to me about that, and tenderizing to look at people and see that. And once again, that's a little bit like we said before, taking the other perspective. What must it be like to be walking towards Starbucks with such confidence in one's immortality, unaware perhaps that change and contraction are around the corner?
I think that's beautiful. I feel like I should be dialing you into our death workshop tonight. I talk a little bit about, just looking at a rose, for example. Just, I think part of just bearing witness to the fact that that rose is dying is actually what brings beauty to it. And in a sense, we could bring it all the way back to relationship, because maybe perhaps what keeps two humans in that deep love, in that deep truth, in that deep beauty is the fact that deep down you've only got a certain number of days with this person. One or the other is most likely going to die first, and the other will be scattering the ashes in the yard, as they say.
Yeah. And then now an image that I like is of a candle, a little bit like the rose in that sense. A candle, if it's left to its own devices, when it's lit, it just keeps burning until it's got no more wax left. A candle doesn't, towards the end of its life, look down and say, uh-oh, not much wax left. Let's just burn a little less brightly, a little less intensely. It's this unstoppable, once started, process of combustion, of explosion, that will continue at breakneck speed, fully going until it no longer continues. And the other thing that's interesting about a candle is that it's continuous, but never the same. In other words, you look at a candle flame as it burns, it is, of course, that same candle flame. It's not a different one, it's the same one on a certain level of analysis. But on another level of analysis, it's constantly exploding into a fresh candle flame each time. So actually, it's dying every single moment. It's dying and being born, dying and being born, dying and being born at this terrible breakneck speed, unable or unaware, or both, of how much wax it fundamentally has. And we're like that too. Of course, we can eat healthy and exercise and so on and so forth, but the procession of time that's hurtling us towards that point is always like I said, it can't be negotiated with. Of course, proximity to death polarizes sensitivity to life in the same way, as you correctly said with the rose, that noticing the beauty of and the life of the rose, it immediately suggests its impermanence. But looking at death, being around death, contemplating death, and then walking out and taking a deep breath, very often one can feel a quickening. One can feel the sense of one's aliveness. Fragile, yes, vulnerable, certainly, but recklessly burning in much the same way a candle does.
I concur. I think it's beautiful, and that's why you really neatly summed up exactly why I think the death workshops and things that we do here are so important. Because death is a very wise teacher, and it's often neglected. So in fact, there's some research to suggest that contemplating death actually orientates someone towards happier thoughts. And I understand why. It might seem counterintuitive, but from what you've just said, I think hopefully for people listening, that gives you some idea of how that's possible. In fact, it's almost inevitable.
It's such a fundamental part of being a human being, not only because we die when we die, but also that sense of ongoing death that we always experience. We never have quite this moment again. There's that, and we all have that in common. It's something that we all share, and it unites us, actually. I think that's one of the reasons why sitting at a cafe or something and looking at other people and thinking about death can, for fun, can actually point one to, it can open the heart. It can humanize people, and it can have the sense of togetherness or connection, because we all share that process. And it's a beautiful thing. Life and death together, the tragedy of it all. It is wonderful.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. I'm going to shift gears a little, just in the interest of time. But for the guys out there, is it okay if I ask you, do you have a routine or a discipline? I mean, how important is kind of ritual to you in your daily life? Do you get up and you do this, this, and this, and you get on with your day, or is it a little more flexible than that?
Yeah, I don't mind you asking. I have certain routines. What can I say about routines? And I have certain disciplines, certainly. What are they? I'm very curious about that process of moving something from a discipline to a routine or a habit, migrating something to that. I know it's, how many books have been written about it, but there's something, amazing about that process. And there's something I think quite empowering about it as well. We are, of course, a series of routines and subroutines. Or when I say, of course, I think one could say that we're a series of routines and subroutines. A great deal of what we do is learned so thoroughly that it no longer feels like a performance of a maneuver. Like talking is one obvious example, for instance. But there's many other things: walking, mobilizing ourselves through space, reaching out and grabbing a teacup. Babies can't do that. There's many things that that are natural to us, that are learned, and sometimes we learn them consciously, sometimes we learn them unconsciously. Language patterns of the mind, belief structures, relational habits. A lot of these things are, in a certain sense, they get ingrained, and so. And very often passively. We're not deliberately really choosing these things. They just end up being something we do enough that they become part of our operating system. And so I like this idea of, wow, what happens if you take something away, which creates an opening, or put something in, which presses out a new shape. I think it's very cool. So certain routines that I have, and so, let me say this. So I think often of practice on two fronts. And practice, I think, is this interesting intersection between ritual, routine, and discipline. There's the front, let's say meditation, which is my favorite practice, actually. It's my favorite one at the moment. And I've practiced many things in my life. And I'm a practicer. I love practicing. So it's just one of my strange quirks. But there's the practice of meditation itself. And of course, there's many different meditations, different styles and approaches, and they all kind of take different paths. And of course, you're different to anybody else. So your path's always going to be slightly unique. But in the same way that if you do heavy squats, you're generally going to put on strength and mass. And if you do long distance running, you're generally going to have another kind of physiological effect. Everyone's physiological effect will be slightly different, but certain forms of exercise emphasize certain or produce certain trends in physiological effect. Similar in meditation, there's many different kinds. Concentrate on the breath, just surrender and be with what is. Notice all the tiny little sensations of the body. Wish well to yourself, your loved ones, your enemies, cats and dogs. I mean, there's all different sorts of meditations that take you in different directions. But nonetheless, let's just say whatever you've chosen, you're doing it. You'll follow a path, a road. One thing will lead to another and another. At the very least, you'll get better at doing the technique. And so there are effects. That's if you want the meditation front. Then there's the other front, which is the practice of practice, which is the fact that you're doing it regularly, the fact that you're engaging with it. And there's Bruce Lee said, all knowledge is ultimately self-knowledge. And I think there's something there's something worthwhile pursuing, let's say, meditation, in addition to its specific benefits. There's something good about figuring out how to sit down for 5 minutes a day, or 15 minutes a day, or 2 hours a day, or whatever it might be you do. There's something about the regularity of that. There's something about the creativity of that, creating something from nothing, where previously, if you'd done nothing at all, if you hadn't manifested that creativity, there would be nothing or negative. What I mean by that is, if you go to the gym, you're creating a positive physical change in your body. If you don't go to the gym, it's not that you just stay the same. In a certain sense, you go back. So there's this sense in which you're never able to stand still. So when you positively engage with that fact, you can create amazing things. That's the practice of practice. Of course, when people practice anything, it doesn't matter if it's playing guitar, going to the gym, doing meditation, learning Rosetta Stone Spanish, whatever it is, that we all face, no matter what you're going to do, you're going to face the same stuff, which is yourself. You're going to face the way your mind works, the way the mind works, your own individual stuff, as well as the generic things. What's it like to build a habit? What's it like to come face to face with ignorance? If you try to learn something new and you don't know it, you're going to feel ignorant. You're going to feel confused because you are, because you don't know it. That's a part of the process. And we get out of the habit of that. And sometimes I think, like a bodybuilder has to become a connoisseur of weakness. If a bodybuilder goes to the gym and wants to feel strong, which is the goal, weight training kind of person, wants to feel strong, then they're not going to be able to produce the correct adaptation effect. A bodybuilder needs to know how to weaken himself through the stress of the training in order to produce the adaptation effect. In a certain strange way, he needs to learn to become weak in order to become strong. If a bodybuilder goes too far, of course, you're going to injure yourself. So that's why you have to be a connoisseur. It's not enough that you're strained. It's not enough that you're taxed, because too much of that, not very intelligent, you're not going to either be able to recover. So one has to be awake in the midst of the weakness. And some people say that in order to learn, you have to be outside of your comfort zone. Yeah, maybe that's true. But just because you're outside of your comfort zone doesn't mean you're learning. So if we say that in order to learn, you're going to necessarily be somewhat occasionally outside your comfort zone, yeah. But just because you're outside of your comfort zone doesn't mean you're learning. You could be overwhelmed. Cults use this tactic. They'll say that you'll be like confused, overwhelmed, uncomfortable, and they'll say, yes, that means you're learning. Isn't it true that when you learn, you're uncomfortable? Sometimes. Yeah, it is true. Well, you're uncomfortable. That must mean you're learning. It doesn't follow logically, but it's what people say. So, and then you go, yeah, of course. Or sometimes you think, no, I don't want this. And it's a boundary. And the person will say, well, isn't it true that the ego always tries to defend itself? This is a defense mechanism of the ego. Or isn't it true that people are afraid of intimacy and so on? And say, yeah, well, that is sometimes true. Well, look, see, that's what that is. And we pathologize boundaries. Anyway, this is a bit of a tangent.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you for taking it.
Yeah. Well, the point is, anyway, that there's something beautiful about whatever the discipline that is common to most disciplines, which I think in many ways is the best part of it. So yes, I do meditate each day, and it's a passion of mine. I've had other disciplines in the past. That's my primary one at the moment, I would say. But it's a continuation, like a relay race, handing the baton on from all the other disciplines I've had. And so sometimes people worry, what should I do? What's the right meditation to do? Am I doing it right? How's it going? Should I be doing this other thing? And these are all valid concerns. But something that's always reassured me is that if you're doing something, then you're always winning on the front of the practice of practice. You can't always progress in the practice of meditation. You can't always progress meaningfully in the direction of the particular discipline you're engaged in, for various reasons. but you can always progress. You can always do something positive in that practice of practice, that creating something from nothing kind of space.
I love that. I think that's, again, I'm going to sit with that for a while. For sure, for sure. I guess it's. I feel like we need to ask you a little bit about how you got to where you are right now, Steve. And this is maybe something we should have said at the beginning or talked about in the beginning, but we can do it at the end. I think that's fine. But I guess people have now heard a little bit from you, and quite clearly there's a lot of wisdom coming through, and there's just so much experience on so many different fronts. And my simple question is, how did you get here? Like, where are you from? Where on earth, if you indeed that's where you're from? Um, what took you on this tangent? Like, why are you not a carpenter or a lawyer or a banker? I mean, was there a moment when things changed or things opened up for you, or was it kind of more of just a progression from early age?
Yeah, I've been pondering that since you sent that to me yesterday, actually, that how to answer that. And and of course, the easy answer is to say that, lots of things go into where you are, and who knows where it comes from. But I was then trying to think, well, is there something I can actually say that gives, one incident that doesn't encapsulate everything, but gives you, and I think there is actually. But the brief. So anyway, would you rather me more biographical, or should I rather give an incident that was quite dramatic or quite, should we say, like changed course in a way that then unfolded, and then people can kind of piece that together? Do you want me to summarize my?
Like, I'll leave it open and take it where you wish.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll. I guess people want to know my biography. They can just read the show notes, right? You'll probably
for sure.
But I come from a little island called Shetland, off the north coast of Scotland, and blah 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 blah, and all the other things. So, and now I'm in California. Yeah, actually, there is something that I can say, and I don't talk about it a great deal, but I think it'll at least be interesting. I was coming home. I used to be involved in the music industry for about 10 years. In fact, I was what's called a session guitarist. And I was depping or sitting in on a musical called Evita. I was in London, and of course we have the West End there. So Evita is a musical, and I was doing a week on that. And I'd finished that, and I was coming back on the train and went to sleep and woke up the next day. And I had a sort of, as most musicians do, it was Monday. It's like kind of a slow day for musicians generally. And I got up and everything was nice and so on. And then, well, gosh, I went to the toilet and massive amounts of black tar emerged from the place you'd expect it would emerge from. And I thought, my goodness, what's that? Turned out, to cut a very long story short, I'd had in a tremendous amount of internal bleeding in the intestines that had come from a congenital birth defect, actually, to put it that way, which I was unaware I had. Turns out I'm not perfect after all. My mother was wrong. Anyway, so that's the long story short. Of course, I went to the GP and said, "What about this?" And she said, "Oh, have you eaten a lot of licorice? Sometimes that can make things black." And I thought, well, no, and this is really a lot. To cut a long story short, about over 10 days, I had a very little amount of blood in my body. Now, when you lose a lot of blood, you also lose red blood cells. And red blood cells transport the oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. And you're supposed to have, I think, as a male, 14 to 16, something like that, red blood cell count, hemoglobin count. People start dying around 7, I've been told. When eventually, about 10 days later, I went to the hospital, it was at 4.
Wow.
And so I was laying in bed thinking to myself, I didn't want to go to the hospital. So I was thinking to myself, well, if I can get to the bathroom and back again, because I need to go to the bathroom. If I can go to the bathroom without having to sit down or anything like that, then I'll wait until the morning, because it wasn't getting any better. And then I thought, yeah, that's what I'll do. And if I can't, I'll just go to hospital, I guess. And then so I lifted my head up to go to the bathroom, and my head fell back. And I realized, oh, I can't even get up, actually. That's not good. So ambulance comes and they take me out. And in the ambulance, they were saying to me, they were reassuring me. It was very odd. They said, don't worry. This is the sort of reason people have ambulances. You were right to call the ambulance. They were sort of telling me that. It's very interesting. And I went with my brother, who I was living with at the time in London. We get there, we're driven in, and all, chaos breaks loose, and nurses are coming, and they're sticking, emergency transfusion. Anyway, my brother goes to step out of the little bay I was in order to call my parents to inform them of the situation. And the doctor sort of was coming in, and the doctor said to him, don't go, he's probably not going to make it. And so I heard that. And it was like, those cathode ray TVs that you pull the cord. This is, I think I'm showing my age here. You pull the cord, and then when it switches off, it goes, everything recedes to a white dot.
Yeah.
It was like that. It's like everything went and sort of shut off. And then I saw my whole life going before my eyes, but in images. So it was like when someone raffles a deck of cards, and I was seeing this like that, going really, really fast, really, really fast. And then at the end of that, this is the sort of strange things that happens to people when they're right on the brink of death, right? And people who've looked into these sort of near-death experiences and so on will know all kind of weird stuff happens. And so that went through, and then I had this picture like one of those Japanese calligraphy paintings, and I had in my mind this idea that part of the point of those Zen master doing a calligraphy is that it's that spontaneous action, it's the just doingness of it. So then this hand went and drew a line like across a Japanese paper with a brush stroke, and it had that feeling of spontaneous just doingness. And the feeling was of completion and perfection, that my whole life had, for whatever reason, come up to that point, and it was perfect. Not that I'd done everything right by any stretch. I made a lot of mistakes, but the fact that it all kind of had to go that way up to that point. There was a sense of completion or finality, and it was sort of felt like the end in that way. And then kind of comes back again, like the TV's powering back, and I'm back. And I looked around, and I looked at the curtains, and I looked at the ground, and the feeling, the separation of the inside and the outside of subject-object, you could say, was, this feeling of it was not there. And it was in a way like the curtains were me, in a way, or no more me or less me, no less me than the things I would normally think of as me. And then in a certain sense, I looked down, if you will, and I experienced my body. And I experienced my body as a constellation of patterns, of forward-moving patterns that had a certain momentum to them, a certain amount of life in them, and that my body was going to continue until it died. And that there was, much like the candle analogy, my body was going to continue living and trying to live, as was its nature, until it ran out of road, until the threads unraveled, and that was the end of that. And then I experienced my mind, and my mind was similarly, which is sort of like your personality, was similarly this constellation of patterns, of forward-moving threads that also would keep going until it couldn't go anymore. There'd be no sense in which the mind could possibly give up living before it was dead. It would continue with no shields between the end, other than it's just disintegration. And I realized my mind is going to attempt to live as well. So in other words, I experienced what's called the will to live, my body and my mind's will to live, which was in its nature. But I wasn't those things. And the stakes had no sort of, so I was going to keep trying to live unabashedly, but if I didn't manage to do so, there's nothing wrong about that. It didn't feel wrong to die. So it wasn't an acceptance of death that one can sometimes do, where one surrenders to the possibility of death in order to negotiate with death so that you feel less bad about death. It wasn't like that. No, 100% trying to live, but at the same time, quite okay with either option, living or dying. So that was that. And that was, of course, quite transformative.
I imagine. I
Yeah,
imagine. And I guess it begs the question,
uh,
about holding the view. How long could you hold that view for? Or has it ever
yeah,
lasted? Has it, been with you ever since?
exactly. It has been, yes, it has been there. It's sort of burned in a way. And the interesting thing about it is it doesn't preclude any other way of being from happening. So like I said, it wasn't a dissociation, if you want, from anything in particular. It was a broadening or a recontextualization, I would say, of myself. So rather than me being the center of the universe, my body mind, it was like my body mind is a center among centers. So yes, I still feel like I'm here and I'm important and I'm, in there somewhere looking out at you and all this. I still feel that. But on the other hand, that perspective is not privileged somehow as being the life or death universe, lives or dies by what happens to that particular point of view or that particular reference point. So in that sense, that recontextualization of myself, looking at myself, if you want, basically in a bigger picture, I think, to answer your question, one of the effects of that, and there are many, one of the effects of that, I think, is it's opened me up to more possibilities in terms of more possibilities, more perspectives, different ways of thinking, different ways of looking at things. When one isn't so constantly tempting to fiercely defend one's own position, the integrity of one's position, if you experience your position as sort of constantly changing and in a way, then I think there's a greater degree of freedom there and creativity that can come. And also a sense that, I would say one example, which is very silly, is Brexit. So we've had Brexit in the UK, right?
Right.
And as somebody, for those of you don't know, UK has left European Union, which means in the past, anyone in Europe can go and live and work anywhere in Europe. And now when you leave Brexit, you can't do that anymore. You have to get visas. So if you're maybe going on tour, you have to get a visa to every single country you go to, right? Real pain. And if for some reason you wanted to live in Germany or France, you can't, and no, everyone's really sad about it. And it's annoying to me. It's personally difficult and inconvenient because of the nature of my job and the nature of the sort of person I am. And that is the case. But I find myself quite philosophical about it. I can understand the reason why people wanted that to happen. And I also don't have this sense that somehow everything should be going my way. The fact that it inconveniences me doesn't seem unjust. It's still inconvenient, but it doesn't feel like it's unjust. How could this happen? Why is this happening? The rules are such that bad things aren't supposed to happen or inconvenience isn't supposed to come my way. There's this additional sense of injustice, I think, that's not there. And that, or is reduced anyway, let's put it that way. Let's not speak too broadly. Is reduced. Mm-hmm. And I think that's quite good. So I was thinking of what I might say in answer to that question, and I wanted to give you something a little bit more personal, actually, and less philosophical and less analytical. So that's what I thought I'd offer up.
Well, it's beautiful and very much talks to the types of discussions we have within the Warrior Within group too. And for me, it kind of begs the question: do you think a person needs to have that kind of experience in order to kind of, broadly speaking, wake up? Which is a terrible phrase, but you know what I'm driving at. Or do you think you can come to it without having one of those sort of pivotal? Because I mean, for me, like I could insert my own experience in a similar kind of a journey, but I'm wondering if it needs to be that way.
Really? What happened to you in a sentence?
Oh well, it's a couple of things, but I lost my mother and my sister to they took their own lives, and shortly after that, I was diagnosed with a blood cancer, and I think across that period of time, I had several experiences, maybe not quite so profound as what you did, but had the same impact. Yeah, I mean, basically, I ended up in a psych ward for a little while after my diagnosis because those things just happened a bit too quickly. And I guess I went into a sense of overwhelm. But from that place, within that place, and then coming out of that place, I began to experience the type of thoughts that you had around my existence, and I've been able to hold that for you since.
That's fascinating. Yeah,
Mm.
I'd love to quiz. See, I actually prefer being the person asking the questions than the person answering the questions. So I'd like to quiz you about that, but I know it's not the format. So, so your question was do all people need to go through that?
Or something. I mean, my view is, maybe you just need to stub your toe and you have that experience. But is there a kind of a pivotal moment or a pivotal experience that is required to kind of bump you into this way of thinking or this way of being?
Mhm. Well, it's the sudden or gradual conundrum. Does one need to have a sudden change in perspective,
Mm.
or is a gradual change in perspective as impactful? This is a debate. I'm drawing that from the Zen tradition, for instance, which has this debate. Of course, in Zen, I don't know how interesting this will be to your listeners, but anyway, I think we've gone well off any reservation, so may as well continue.
It's all great. It's
Can
all
you
good.
hear those dogs, by the way?
Now you've pointed it out, not before, so it's cool.
Okay, I'll continue.
Yeah.
Um, okay, someone's shushing them. That's good. That's really rather loud. Yeah. So
They're your
we
dogs,
have,
by the way?
yeah, Michaela's dogs. She has these little rescue dogs,
Oh,
and
okay.
they're the most terrific little chaps. But damn, they're loud when they get going. One of them howls, and they all howl, and for reasons that only dogs understand. So anyway, yeah, there's that debate, and one of the you could say one of the ways to characterize. You talked about waking up. I think is to see things more clearly, to see through. It's often characterized that as seeing through delusion, or seeing through, and sometimes like a mirage. The thing with a mirage is not that it's not real. A mirage is real. It's just not an oasis. So if you're in the desert and you see an oasis in the distance and you stumble towards it and you arrive and it's not an oasis, it's just sand, you might say that was not real. It's not that it wasn't real, it's just not what you thought it was. The mirage was real, it was a real mirage. It just wasn't an ocean. And a lot of life is like that. We take certain things, we treat certain things one way when actually they are that way in a way, but in other ways they're not. But anyway, so does one need to have some aha or eureka moment? I think not, actually. It is something that can happen to people. People can have aha moments. Sometimes people have an aha moment that lasts a brief period of time, and they can taste the echo of it, but hasn't got that sense of. But if they're honest, it doesn't have that immediacy, or that it's not really there. Other people can have an aha moment and become so acclimatized to it that they feel like it's gone, but it's not that it's gone. It's just that they've become acclimatized to it. That can happen. Other people can have an aha moment and they crystallize around that aha moment. And they say, I want to always have this sense of shock, wonder, and surprise at this insight. In other words, the one Zen teacher said that today's enlightenment is tomorrow's mistake.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and in Zen they had this idea of the Makkyo, or the devil cave. A devil cave is basically an insight that you get, that you hold on to, and you think, so you identify with, and you think, well, now I've woken up, or I've had a waking up experience, and you crystallize on that, and then all you've done is you've changed your previous fixed position, an identity that you had before, with a new one. This one is identity beyond identity, or it's having woken up, or something like this. But actually, you're in a different prison cell, but this time the bars, maybe there's some incense,
Yes.
prayer flags and stuff. It's the same basic idea though as before. So that can happen. And I think actually that that it doesn't, that it's not required actually. And the point of an aha experience, it can of course be used as an identity marker, which is I think something of a mistake. But one of the points of it is its relevance is in how it plays out in the rest of one's mundane life. That's the venue of life. The venue of life isn't in the aha moments exclusively. It's the mundane, everyday, walking around, interacting, getting up in the morning, having a coffee, going to the toilet, taking a shower, all these sorts of things. In a sense, there's nothing special about those things. But in another sense, they're very profound. And we've talked a lot about how profound life is when you consider death. Every moment, if you knew you were going to die in 24 hours, you look out the window and suddenly the sparrows, are so wonderful and the leaves are so green. And
Well, the truth is, Steve, that you very well might. So you should take that view.
Yes, that's true. How to integrate the possibility of your dying at any moment, whilst the probability is constantly shifting.
Right.
That's the thing. Because every other day I've woken up, I've been alive. So it's difficult to quantify. So I have good reason to assume that all the rest of my days I'll wake up. That's why death comes as such a shock to people, is because we haven't done it before. We can remember. And once again, I'm putting entirely reincarnation. So I don't think that's even necessary to think about that. I don't know what I think about that actually myself. But I know from my own, mundane experience that every time I've woken up, I've been alive.
Yeah.
And other than that incident where I almost died and faced death, and had that very close brush with it, which was actually very liberating in a way. So far, so good.
No, I agree. I guess the reason why I came to asking you that around whether you think you need an experience or a moment is that for most of the guys that turn up in the Warrior Within group, there's been a trigger moment for them. Life's sort of going along swimmingly, and they've lost their job, they've lost money, their wife's left them, they've had a health issue, they've lost a friend, or there's something. There's a triggering event, not in all cases, but in many. Which has caused them to kind of, turn the dial inwards and kind of focus on what's going on internally, rather than just looking at the external all the time. And lo and behold, they show up in the group.
Yes, I think that's perhaps a slightly different. I didn't quite understand then that was the sorts of things you were pointing to. In that case, I still don't think it's necessary. But when things don't perform as expected, is generally that. I think that's the category. It's like system error does not compute. Things are not my reality or my worldview is not performing as expected. Something which does not fit my model has happened, and some people bury that and proceed with a sort of cognitive dissonance. Other people they're forced in a way to update their model, and they start to then have to look beyond the scope of the sphere of influence and information that they're currently existing in generally, because that's what's informed their existing model, and they start seeking. And people turn to psychology and self-help. They turn to men's groups such as that you run. People turn to religion, of course, for any explanation, any merchant of meaning and certainty, becomes of interest. And I think one of the best things someone can do in our sorts of position, where we do encounter people like that who are looking to update their model in the face of data that doesn't fit their model, is to encourage the process of inquiry and investigation, because it's very easy to placate somebody's question. You could say, well, this has happened, let me give you the answer, or let me give you it, but you're not giving them the answer. You're giving them an answer. You're giving them a sense of certainty. You're smothering the inquiry, as uncomfortable as it may be. That inquiry is the spark of awakeness, I think. That's the part of you that continues to look, really. And just as we were saying before, that a bodybuilder needs to become, a connoisseur of weakness in order to be strong. In order to be wise, I think you need to be comfortable, or not comfortable, that's wrong. In order to be wise, you need to become acquainted with confusion and ignorance. So be able to simmer like a sausage in a pan and to live in the contradiction of the known and the unknown. That some things I know, some things I don't. I don't know how much of what I know is not going to be the same tomorrow. I mean, it's really quite a mess, but it's extremely creative. It's the plus and minus coming together, causing what you're talking about there, awakeness in some sort of a sense. Some people, it seems, they're just walking along one day and it just suddenly occurs to them some existential question, and then they're thrown into this sort of this seeking that you've described there. So I don't think necessarily something terrible needs to happen, like it happened to you, something very horrible. But I see what you're pointing at. Yes, I do think that's a trend, actually.
And do you see that potentially in the one-on-one, the private clients that you have, that there's been a trigger event as such, or is there a whole range of things that has to happen?
Yeah, sometimes divorce is a good one.
Yeah,
I'd say divorce is one of the most common ones. In America, it's last statistic I looked at, things we're talking about men in a heterosexual context, divorce initiated 80% of the time by women in America, which means that for whatever reason, good or bad, I'm not judging any of the reasons for it. I'm just saying that a great deal of men don't see it coming, or at least it's not what they wanted. They didn't initiate it, right? It comes at them, rather than them filing for it. And it can really shake to the core. And a lot of men, I think there's partly biological and evolutionary reasons for that, partly culturally. We're highly attuned to the well-being of our mate. That's why if your partner is in a bad mood, it kind of actually is painful. It's difficult to be around some partner who's in a bad mood, because I think I have speculation as to why this is, which I think we have no time to go into now. But I think it's certainly observable to many people that when your partner is in a bad mood, justified or unjustified, it can feel a little bit like being held prisoner. You can't rest, you can't relax. It's very difficult to say, well, that's your problem, that's your bad mood, I'm fine on the sofa. Really difficult to do that. You have to really disconnect and really pull back in order to do that. And that's not something I've seen many men be capable of doing without really damaging themselves. And so divorce is a big one that can happen, or failed relationships. And the way that culturally we're going in terms of relationships, we don't need each other as much. Men don't need, women don't need men for a lot of the things they used to. My mother, when she married my father, couldn't get a mortgage because she was a woman. It wasn't, sort of one-off case. Women weren't allowed to get mortgages at that time in the UK. It was around that time when she graduated, people were saying, well, you're a smart girl, maybe you should be a doctor rather than a nurse. Because then just ladies were nurses, men were doctors. That's just how it was. It was just the culture at that time. So in that sense, if you wanted a mortgage, you needed a guy, one of the ways. And there are many other little things like that men and women in a certain sense needed each other, or it was assumed and so on. Now, with the great deal more freedom we have, there are not as many cultural and societal forces in the developed world pressing us or pushing us together to be together. So therefore, people get together with the momentum of the old patterns. And when they're in relationship, they don't know why or how, or why isn't it working, or what's the point of this anyway? You're looking at somebody thinking, you're no longer novel.
Yeah.
What good are you if you're no longer novel? I don't feel, what's the point? And that's a good question. That's actually not a bad question or an insensitive question if you take it seriously. It's a really good question. What is there beyond the novelty and the feel-good hormones? What's the point of relationship? That's an extremely deep and important question, because a lot of people's assumptions about relationships, the whys and wherefores, are out of date. So that is a crisis that I think can also jump the rails of one's cultural programming and find oneself asking the question, I need to update my model.
There's a whole nother discussion we could have around that for sure. I mean, I was particularly interested when you said that men often don't see it coming. And that's something that, you know, in my own life, I can certainly attest to, but also a lot of the guys that we see in the circle. And it's particularly interesting. It's, you know, the guy will often say, you know, I didn't see it coming and now she's left me. And you speak to the woman in a heterosexual relationship and she'll say, I've been telling him for ages.
Yeah, miscommunication.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a big part of it. No intimacy, in the sense that very often we don't relate to the other. We relate to the idea of the other one.
Mm.
We relate to the potential of the other one. You know, when we're attracted to somebody, of course, we don't initially, we're not attracted to them. We're attracted to our idea of them. We're attracted to the possibilities that they represent, or what's implied by what we observe. And most of that's going on. I mean, of course, they're contributing to a certain degree. But most of that is 80% of what I just described is in the mind of the observer, and not intrinsic to the one that one is attracted to. So, of course, you know, divesting oneself, disillusioning oneself in relationship to your partner is an extremely important process. I think it's also a very exciting process because it's moving beyond what you imagine and what you project into what's actually there. And what one finds when one deeply investigates a rose, as you said, a candle, as I said, we chose very simple things, or indeed an intimate partner, is far more unpredictable, exciting, and diverse than anything I think than your projections were. And of course, when one begins that process of really getting to know a person, you know, of course, that's a good, sometimes you find out you shouldn't be with them and they're not a very nice person. All right, that's fine. But, you know, if you find somebody with whom you're going to go for a while with in that way, it can be a very beautiful thing. So I think that's often the case. Two people engaged in relationship in parallel, side by side, with themselves, with their own projections, with the face of this person on it. You know, and then bang, things aren't what I thought they were, the guy says. I've been dumped. I've been divorced. I never saw it coming. This is not my model. I've jumped the rails now, and I'm laying on the side of the railway track, dusty, bruised, battered, you know, and awake.
Oh, well, maybe that's a beautiful place to end it there, Steve. I think that's perfect. So I just want to say thank you for spending this time with us. You know, we'll see what people say, but I'm sure we'd love to have you on again at some point in the future if that's something you're open to.
Certainly. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and I know you've got, so you're in Australia a couple of times through the year. I think maybe the easiest thing to do, rather than to, you know, continue spending time on this call, is I'll pop something in a post just outlining what that is.
Yeah.
And we can go from there. But yeah, that's the great news for everyone listening, that we've got the opportunity to actually spend some time with Steve and Michaela in their workshops in Australia. In fact, in Melbourne later in the year.
Yeah, it's been really enjoyable thinking these things through with you, Asher. Your questions are very cool. Like I said, I wish we could, you know, interview each other in a way, or have, you know, because the little things you've said there make me very curious about your point of view. But yeah, it's so cool to ponder these mysterious questions together. So thank you.
Great pleasure. Thanks again, Steve. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.